on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 7 o'clock, a US security expert has told LBC he believes lithium batteries may be behind pagers exploding in the pockets of members of Hezbollah in Lebanon. At least 8 people are dead and thousands more have been injured in the attack, which is being blamed on Israel. The Israeli military has refused to comment at a time of heightened tensions across the Lebanese border. Christopher Burgess, who spent 30 years within the CIA, has told Tonight with Andrew Marr how he thinks the plot was carried out.
I would go along the path that it was the lithium battery as opposed to putting explosives in each pager that was part of a purchase order. That to do that increases the level of difficulty to an extraordinary amount unless you're at the manufacturer.
A French man accused of drugging his then-wife and inviting dozens of men to assault her has told a court, "I am a rapist." Dominique Pellicot is facing 20 years in prison after admitting to the crimes, which has shocked France. 50 others stand accused of the rape of Giselle Pellicot, who has waived her anonymity over a period of 10 years. LBC's correspondent in Paris, Peter Allen, has told Andrew Marr it has thrown into question the country's attitudes towards morality.
What's happening more and more now, because of movements such as Me Too and feminist groups taking the stand against what's going on, it is certainly becoming a societal issue. And again, this sort of knockabout view of sex by very powerful men that's always existed in French culture, that's been questioned. And people are saying, look, really, something has to change.
A man has been arrested on suspicion of sexual assault at the Liberal Democrat Party conference. A 57-year-old from Bristol was detained at the Grand Hotel in Brighton around midnight. The Lib Dems say one person has been suspended from the party. US hip-hop artist Sean Diddy Combs has been charged with sex trafficking and racketeering in New York. He was arrested in Manhattan late last night, 6 months after his homes in LA and Miami were raided as part of an investigation. The 54-year-old is being sued by a number of people accusing him of physical or sexual abuse. He's denied many of the allegations. A US court has rejected Ghislaine Maxwell's appeal against her sex trafficking conviction. The 62-year-old was found guilty in 2021 of luring young girls in order for Jeffrey Epstein to molest them over a period of 10 years. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison in New York the following June. And Instagram is introducing a new so-called teen account for all users under the age of 16. Children will need their parents' permission to change any of the default settings. Molly Russell took her own life at the age of 14, having suffered with depression and being exposed to harmful content. Her father, Iain, has told LBC social media companies have been too slow to act.
Molly Rose Foundation did research last November when Molly would have been 21, and that research found that the sort of content she was looking at in the 6 months before she died is still largely available on the platform, still very easy to find, and what's more, still algorithmically recommended by the platform. So as soon as you dipped your toe into that sort of content, the platform will be serving you more of that sort of content.
In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed up 31 points at 83.09. The pound buys $1.31 and €1.18. LBC weather, clear and dry tonight, foggy in the north and west, lows of 6. Another warm and dry day tomorrow, low cloud in southern and central parts, clearing to leave a sunny day for most, a high of 24 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Amelia Cox.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening and welcome to the programme. It's Iain Dale with you. It's 4 minutes past 7 on LBC. Now, we're streaming the whole of tonight's programme on Global Player, so if you'd like to watch us as well as listen, you can do that. We'd encourage you to do so. And the reason we're doing that is because at 9 o'clock we have Tom Tugendhat. We're going to be interviewing all of the 4 Conservative leadership candidates over the course of the next couple of weeks. It's Tom Tugendhat tonight, James Cleverly tomorrow night at 9. And we also have Wes Streeting on the programme tomorrow at 7 o'clock. But in this hour, we have Grant Shapps with us, former Defence Secretary. And I was keen to get him in because I think one of the things that I have noticed, and I've said this before over the past few months, is that Ukraine has been eclipsed as an issue. Now, it is back in the news for obvious reasons at the moment, but I think it's really important that we keep talking about Ukraine. So I was very keen to do that in my first week back. And given what's been going on about the debate as to whether British missiles should be used by Ukraine to be fired into Russia, I thought it was a good idea to get a former Defence Secretary in. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Tory leadership contest as well. And then after past, we're going to take your calls. So if you want to stack them up now, you can be first in the queue. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put your question to former Defence Secretary and for these purposes, former Conservative Party Chairman Grant Shapps. I mean, you've had welcome by the way, you've had so many different cabinet roles.
Yeah, I looked it up the other day. I've had the most cabinet roles since Jim Callaghan in 1979. Or before 1979.
That's quite a record.
Yes. So yeah, I ended up in a lot of different roles. It was kind of an interesting...
Which did you enjoy most?
Oh, Defence.
Really?
I mean, all the others put together, really, for Defence, because, fundamental duty of the nation is to defend itself and its citizens, and this is just the defence of the realm right at the forefront of it. And, of course, an extraordinarily complex time in the world. You had a war in Europe, a conflict that broke out on October 7th last year in the Middle East. And so a much more dangerous world, and a world where defence spending by necessity needs to rise. And so I was there for that whole debate, if you like, and I input into that with a speech I gave earlier in the year in Lancaster House, where I argued we need to move up to 2.5% as a country and get the Western Alliance to follow us.
Well, you go into a job like that. I mean, I don't think you had any military experience, did you?
No.
I mean, do you have a certain amount of inferiority complex or imposter syndrome? Because it's not a job where you can spend 6 months reading yourself into it, is it?
No, because for this reason. If you go into that job, you are surrounded by military folk, right? And you've got the chief of the defence staff, you've got heads of each of the services, you've got more military experts, and that's before you even get onto the armchair generals who are not scared of telling you what they think from their armchairs, having often been in studios like this, yeah. Military knowledge is not what's missing. What they need in the Ministry of Defence is somebody who understands how government works, understands how you fight for and lobby for the things that your ministry or department requires. And no one, literally in Whitehall, had more experience, as you said, of going around different departments and doing that. My proudest moment, possibly in politics actually, was arguing for and successfully winning defence spending to increase to 2.5% of GDP, which means tens of billions more on defence, because I think this is, as I say, the first job of a government and the most important thing that we need to be doing to protect our way of life. And if I may, I'll just tell you why. I lost the election on the 4th of July and I stood up and made a concession speech. And what I want is for that to be a right for our citizens. If you want to boot a government out, you should bloody well have the opportunity to do that. What Putin and others who are autocrats want is to end that arrangement. So you can't... So as I said in a recent Sunday Times article, I'm, if you like, fighting for the Western values we believe in, which is, amongst other things, the right to be a political loser and walk away when you've been beaten. And that's something that these autocrats do not want to see happen.
We'll come on to defence in a second, but when did you realise you were going to lose? Was it actually on the night?
Well, I thought, with the way that the campaign was going in, I was not entirely taken, not knocked over sideways. I said to Rishi that Wednesday when he called the general election, I really wouldn't have done that. I think that this is a mistake. I mean, remember, the Parliament could have run to January next year.
So he didn't consult you?
No.
Did he consult anyone?
No.
I mean, you're a senior cabinet minister.
No, he called the senior cabinet ministers in to let us know, in a discussion which I thought, actually in his study, which I thought was going to be about, look, I've been thinking, what do you guys reckon? And instead, actually, it was, I've just come back from the palace and the King's graciously agreed to dissolve Parliament. Now, look, I'm the first to concede. You never know what what might have been otherwise. How can we tell? So who knows? Maybe it would have been even worse waiting, and some would argue that. I don't think so, though. Since the election, we've had inflation lower, interest rates have been cut, a growth in the economy in the first and second quarters, actually leading the G7 in the first, and unemployment fall. I really think there was a lot coming through that we should have stood and argued and fought for, and I made that point. But in the end, it's a lonely job being Prime Minister. You do actually have the role prerogative for calling an election falls on your shoulders.
It is a lonely job, but thinking back in political history, I can't recall another example of a Prime Minister doing it, basically going alone without the agreement of the Cabinet.
I don't know, because you never quite know how individual... I've sat in lots of different cabinets. They all work slightly differently, and it depends on the desire of the Prime Minister. But I do know that Prime Ministers tend to make these heavy decisions on their own. Of course, in the first Parliament that I was a minister in, that was the coalition one, and it was a fixed-term Parliament, so this question was entirely removed. But, the one advantage in a non-fixed-term Parliament, which is the one we normally have, and it's what we've got now, that the Prime Minister normally has, is you can choose when to call the election. So call it when you're not going to take your own side by surprise. The point is to take the other lot by surprise.
Right. Let's talk about Ukraine, because the big argument at the moment is whether Britain should give permission to use these Storm Shadow missiles. Now, as I understand it, if we do, those missiles, and I think Vladimir Putin has cottoned onto this, but maybe I'm wrong, they have to be operated by British Armed Services personnel. Now, if that is the case, then you can understand Putin saying, well, that is a declaration of war by Britain.
I can't go into the operational detail of how Storm Shadows operate, but I can say, and this is, a fact that's known, that we've given our weapons to Ukraine, and in other cases we don't say to Ukraine, here's our weapons, but by the way, you must fight this war, which, as I've already said, I think is existential for our freedom and way of life and our values. But you must have one hand tied behind your back. And by the way, you can't prosecute the war in a way that we don't approve of. Now, I'm not suggesting that Ukraine should break international law. So, in other words, they must only attack military targets, so the bases from which Putin is launching aircraft with glide bombs, which were murdering Ukrainian men, women and children, would be a legitimate place to attack, not a housing estate in Russia. So I think it's absolutely proper and right. I took what I could describe as forward-leaning decisions, which were difficult to make because Putin was making all the same blood-curdling noises about things that would happen when I took those decisions, when Ben Wallace took them before me, and Boris Johnson. And we know that Putin is a bluffer. He does not want to take on NATO, with good reason. NATO is considerably more powerful. But it isn't acceptable, in my view, to see a democratic European nation be pummeled and potentially, if we don't step in, defeated by an autocrat, by a dictator, because we're telling Ukraine, the democratic nation, that you can't actually fight back and you've got to somehow do this.
But we do that, don't we, with Saudi Arabia? We make conditions on how they can use the weapons that we're supplying them.
Well, Saudi Arabia, we're good friends with Saudi Arabia and we do a lot of trade with them, but they're not a democracy, right, by any imagination. They're not right here in our own continent where we've seen the history of what happened in the last century, twice in Europe. They haven't been invaded. So there's three differences off the top of my head. The point here is Ukraine has been invaded and they continue to be pummeled from glide bombs launched in Russia, aircraft in Russia, and you've got to be able to take out the source of that. We must urgently get this approved. And the other thing that worries me about it is Britain has been at the forefront. We've led the way. President Zelensky has said to me before, we wouldn't be in this war today if it wasn't for Britain's leadership of the rest of the world. We need to stand up and lead on this again. I actually think that Sir Keir Starmer's heart is in the right place, but he hasn't worked out how to get the government to actually deliver the things that are required, and we need more bravery from him on Ukraine.
But would you agree that it's a different scale of intervention if it is true that these weapons need to have, that the only people trained to use them are British soldiers?
It's not quite that straightforward, and for security reasons I can't precisely describe why, but I can clarify something, which is these weapons would be launched from Ukrainian aircraft, actually typically Su-24, so Soviet-era aircraft by Ukraine, not by us. And if we are going to give Ukraine weapons, and that's a decision that Britain led with, and we started with the NLAW anti-tank missiles and the tanks and all the rest of it, we have to give them permission to use those weapons where it's going to be affected, or we watch Ukraine being crushed, men, women and children in Ukraine being murdered by Putin, and our way of life is what's at threat. Not just what happens in Ukraine, what happens in Britain, what happens in the democratic world.
I'm going to ask you a question to which your immediate answer is going to be, I can't give you any information on this, but maybe there's some degree of clarification, because presumably one of the things that the MOD does is war game if a Russian response. So if we do this, the Russians might react like this, or they might react like that. Now, again, I'm not expecting you to sort of give specifics here. But if Russia as you say, Vladimir Putin has a record of bluffing. But if he doesn't bluff in this and decides, we already know that he regards this country as the leading enemy, I think, in Europe. If he did decide to hit back, it probably wouldn't be necessarily how we think of a conventional military attack, because we've got cyber warfare to contend with at the moment. And I know a lot more resources are being put into combating that. How would you personally see Putin reacting to this if he doesn't?
Putin is a bully, and like every bully, you have to stand up and confront them. And when you don't, the bully pushes further. When you do, what you discover is absolutely everything that Putin has said, right from February the 24th, 2022, has been untrue. He has, in every single case, given out blood-curdling interviews about all the terrible things happening. He knows he can't take on NATO. It is true he can't take on NATO.
Why?
Because actually, if you look at, for example, the number of ships and aircraft and missiles and the rest of it, we have forces, including our army forces combined, we outstretch Russia many, many, many times over. When I was Defence Secretary, I produced a page which showed how many more times boats, ships and weapons, tanks and the rest that we have. And they're far more modern. So he knows that's not something he wants to do. He deliberately wouldn't. Where he gets away, literally, with murder is by calling our bluff. And we've got to understand, this government has got to understand, and I know that our military commanders want them to, that it is important for Britain to take the lead again. And that means being a little bit braver than they've been prepared to do. And all this business of going to Washington and sitting in the White House and pontificating about it, no. The way to do this is you get on and you do it, and you show some leadership in doing it. And as I say, I don't say this without some knowledge of the way the things really work.
We're going to come to some calls. In fact, we'll do that next, and we'll talk about the Tory leadership after the half-past news. We've got some really interesting calls coming in. We're with Grant Shapps for the whole of this hour before Cross Question. So 0345 6060 973 is the number to call. You can watch us also on Global Player. It's 18 minutes past 7.
This is LBC. Text 84850. This is LBC.
Grant Shapps is with us here on LBC. We've been talking about Ukraine. There's obviously a lot of other subjects that a former Defence Secretary could cover. I see we've got a couple of questions here on the Middle East conflict, so we'll maybe dip into that a little bit. After 12:30, we're going to be talking about the Tory leadership contest, so if you've got questions about that. Grant is backing James Cleverly, the former Home Secretary, former Foreign Secretary. But there are, of course, 4 different candidates. We're going to be talking to all of them over the course of the next few days. We've got Tom Tugendhat at 9 o'clock tonight and James Cleverly at 9 o'clock tomorrow night. Let's go to John, who's in Reading. Hello, John.
Lovely to speak to you, Ian. Lovely to speak to you, Mr. Was it Grant or Mr. Shapps? What would you prefer?
Just Sir will do.
Okay. Right, so I've got an interesting question you've not been asked before. Right, there's a major issue at the moment where Russia is relying on mercenary troops from the African continent, from India, Nepal, where they are taking planes over to basically fight for Russia. Should the European countries, such as UK and other European countries, put sanctions via airplanes or the airports who allow basically soldiers to basically go and fight for Russia, especially in particular countries?
Really interesting point. So I think what is very revealing about this war, now 2.5 years old, basically, is, you introduce sanctions in different ways. They could be financial, they could be against oil, lots of different things. And it works for a bit, and then the Russian state finds ways around those sanctions, and things like the ability to ship people around or bring people into the war and become, the latest way that they'll go about circumventing what is pretty universal condemnation of Putin's illegal invasion. So the simple answer is yes, actually. I think it is important that we work on that and stop people from being able to be trafficked in, either to support directly like that, or in other cases to do business that companies are supposed to have stopped doing but not all have, and oil which finds its way into the supply chain and the rest of it. So you have to carry on ratcheting up essentially the sanctions and the restrictions, otherwise over a period of time they lose their force.
OK, John, thank you for that. Dave on a WhatsApp message says, how does Mr. Shapps know for certain what weapons the Russians have? Surely just relying on intelligence, I guess. Tony Blair might have something to say about that.
Well, I think, look, when it comes to Ukraine, we know because we've seen them use them for over 2 years, and we've seen what they've got and also their limitations. And we saw I think the Chinese wheels, tyres on the Russian tanks in that convoy that came down from the north towards Kyiv right at the beginning, and shown wanting. So some of their kit is not very good. On the other hand, they're very heavily into new supply, and they're into new supply both from Iran, who are supplying missiles in, but also, and worryingly, and I said this when I was in office, and there was some pushback actually from the States, but I know it to be true, that China is also in the business of assisting, and that should worry everybody.
Dave in Hampshire says, defence analysts have stated that Storm Shadow requires US military satellites to operate properly. Maybe ask Grant how he thinks Starmer can go it alone, bearing that in mind.
Well, I have to be careful here how I describe them, because this is a sensitive weapon, and its control is obviously classified. We work in partnership with a lot of different governments on things like Storm Shadow. So as you know, that it's the same weapon that the French use. They call it Scalp. The Italians have Storm Shadow. The Americans have
Scalp is a much better name.
Oh, I think Storm Shadow has actually, interestingly, I noticed in France a lot of the time they just refer to it as Storm Shadow. So I think the Storm Shadow has won that battle. The Americans have ATACMS. It's not quite as black and white as that question makes it sound. Yes, cooperation, very, very useful, and it's not too much to say that the conventional way of controlling a missile like a Storm Shadow, which would have been through GPS, is pretty much pointless in Ukraine and large parts of that territory because GPS gets constantly jammed, so weapons have to have other ways of navigating. There's a lot of time-based, space-based navigation that can be used.
But I mean, if the American administration said we are against you giving permission to the Ukrainians for doing this, I mean that would presumably play quite a big role in the decision.
Isn't a single entity. So, the White House often is not quite saying the same thing as the Department of Defense, the DOD or the Pentagon.
That's a bit worrying, isn't it?
Well, only in a way it's very large.
Well, must make it difficult for you.
Organisation often could be, but and then operationally, of course, a lot of the time you can work together, and you often don't require. It often doesn't require the equivalent of a defence secretary to sign something off to operationally work on things as well. So again, this is a difficult question to answer because for a number of security reasons I can't actually quite say what I want to say. However, suffice it to say that leadership requires us to push that envelope, and that is possible to do, and I know that's possible to do because I did it, as did Ben Wallace and Boris Johnson before me. So we know it's possible to do. This government knows what it needs to do. I urge them to get on and do it.
Last week, Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, said on a podcast that if the pair win in November, Trump would seek to open negotiations between Putin and Zelensky in the hope of a peaceful settlement. What's your reaction to that?
Well, look, in the end, as I said before, we've got to decide what our values are as the West. Do we believe in free elections where we accept the result, even when it doesn't go the way we want it, as it didn't for me or my party, or do we want to pour scorn on a result and pretend it's not so, or as happens with Putin, refuse to hold democratic elections, or as happens in China, the only thing that matters is keeping the Communist Party in place. And which system do we want to live under? If we want to live under a system where we are free to choose, then we must back Ukraine, and the answer cannot be negotiations for Ukraine to give up part of their country any more than if the east of America had been invaded. Perhaps they'd like to give up New York and Washington and a few of the cities down the eastern coast. No, why should they?
Well, a question on this from Abdul in Ilford. Hello, Abdul.
Hi, Ian. Okay.
Hi. What would you like to ask?
Yeah, I'm saying, look, the thing is, rather than escalating this further, doesn't Grant think that we should allow Putin to take over, annex Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and one other region? Move the people who are non-Russian speaking or have non-allegiance to Russia. Move them away from those areas, and let Russia annex part of Ukraine and come to a resolution. Just like Grant has supported the moving of 1 million people in Gaza, and then to be killed further in safe areas, and then annexation of West Bank, which is taking place now. Then you should allow that we should allow the annexation of Ukraine as well, according to the same principle, Grant, surely.
Well, first of all, I don't agree with the thing you just said last about Gaza and the West Bank. That's to put words into my mouth that I absolutely don't agree with. And secondly, no, I don't agree with you. I was using the equivalent with what if part of America was invaded, but let's put it into British terms. Let's say that Kent and maybe parts of Essex were invaded. Should we, after 2 or 3 years, go, you know what, maybe we just let Kent and Essex go to whoever's invaded it. That way we can have peace. No, of course not. That is, it cannot be right that force is being used to take over a democratic European country, right? And democracy is actually the key to this. So, if parts of Ukraine, just as if parts of Britain want to secede, they can do that. Accede. They can do that, but there's no military route to that happening, and so no, I completely disagree.
But you can see that Trump and Vance might well think that's a solution to this. Well, let the Russians keep what they had before.
Well, it would be a foolish thing for them to do, and here's why. I'll tell you the country who is most interested in the West's attention or potentially attention deficit in Europe, and that would be China. And if there's one thing we know about Trump is he's not keen on the idea of China's expansion, but China would, I think, look at this and reasonably come to the conclusion that all you need to do is hold out for a few years and then the West gets bored, and why wouldn't they go into Taiwan? And if they go into Taiwan, that would have massive read across, again, another democratic country. But importantly, for the rest of the world, the country that produces a large number of the chips and technology that we
I should
rely on.
say, as an Essex boy who lives in Kent,
yeah, you'd be gone.
Well, a lot of people in Essex would happily get rid of Kent and vice versa. Alexandra, thank you, Abdul. Alexandra is in Newcastle. Very good evening. What would you like to say?
Hello. I want to say, first of all, thank you to all that Britain done for Ukraine as a representative of Ukrainian community so far. We are so grateful, honestly, and this is a fight that we will never give up. We will never surrender. This is our home. And I want to ask Grant Shapps, I want to thank him for everything he said so far. It's so true. And I want to ask, what more can we do as Ukrainians who are in here? You know, my friends, my close friends are in Ukrainian army. My brother, my grandma, my mom, they are all in Ukraine, in Sumy, actually. And my mom just texted me today. She says they have no electricity and no internet, so I wouldn't worry because they are fine, even though they are like having a couple of hours of electricity a day. So they will not give up. Just so you know, this is a fight for life for us. So how else can we convince the British public to stick by us?
Well, I think your phone call, first of all, really helps, because it is a reminder that this is still very much an active war, even though it's not on the front pages quite as much as it was nearer the beginning, but it still goes on. And we've got to remember both the suffering that's taking place in Ukraine, but also that this is on our own continent. This is where we live, folks, and it's not that far away. If you've flown to Greece or Cyprus or somewhere on holiday, you've done this distance flight many times if you've travelled to Europe, and it is on our doorstep. And it is foolish for anyone to imagine that what goes on over there doesn't matter here, because Putin would carry on. He'd go into Poland, he'd go into the Baltics. We would see, as I've said several times, our very way of life changed. It already has been through the high energy bills by this. So thank you for calling in. And I think it's really important that the now very large Ukrainian community in Britain keeps reminding everybody that this war is ongoing, unresolved, and that we need to stick with it.
And it is really important, Alexandra, that people like you do phone into programmes like this, because we get so many Russian apologists phoning in, which, as you will have heard me in previous programmes, exasperates the hell out of me, and I try to take them to task as best I can. But nothing is better than it coming from, and I'm not calling you a horse, but from the horse's mouth, because you're living it every day. Thank you very much indeed for your call. We'll come back to more of your calls on this and maybe some other defence issues in a bit, but I'm going to turn to the Tory leadership in just a moment. But first, the news headlines on LBC. It's 7:33, and here's Amelia Cox.
At least 8 people have died in Lebanon when pagers belonging to members of Hezbollah exploded. Officials are blaming Israel for the attack, but the Israeli military has refused to comment. US hip-hop artist Sean Diddy Combs has been charged with sex trafficking and racketeering following his arrest in New York. It comes roughly 6 months after authorities raided his homes in LA and Miami. He's previously denied allegations of physical or sexual abuse. And a man charged with the murder of 3 women in a crossbow attack in Hertfordshire will enter a plea later this year. 26-year-old Kyle Clifford is accused of killing Carol Hunt and her 2 daughters, Hannah and Louise, in Bushey in July. LBC weather, clear and dry tonight, foggy in the north and west, lows of 6 degrees.
LBC. This is LBC with Iain Dale. Call 0345 6060 973.
7:36 on LBC. Former Defence Secretary and Conservative Party Chairman Grant Shapps with me for the hour. We've been talking about defence issues. Let's turn our attention to the Conservative leadership contest, which in fact, I think I know. If you had been re-elected, you would have been a candidate in.
I think it's highly likely I would have stood, not least because of the amount of experience that I'd had. So then had a very clear vision about how I think that this government could operate and how it should operate for the public and for the people of Britain. And I think if we got our act together as a country, we would be better than the sum of our parts. And I think we could have an extraordinary future. But unfortunately, I think too much of the time we get distracted into some real nooks and crannies that end up just holding the country back. And that would have been the thing that I would have wanted to have tackled if I were standing. But that will have to all wait till another day.
And you haven't lost the political bug, have you?
No, I mean, actually, it's interesting. I didn't know how I'd feel, realising that there was a very good chance that I wouldn't be able to hold my seat against the sort of political tsunami coming my way. I didn't know how I'd feel. I'd been in government a very long time, an MP even longer. But actually, it's actually been quite a nice experience, a lot more freedom, particularly from the last post of Defence Secretary, where you quite literally lie awake at night and worry about the attack that you last ordered or whatever is happening. And also I was in a protected role where you have people with you all the time. You can't leave your house without making arrangements in advance, and that includes when you're just going out for a walk on a Sunday with my wife, for example. There'd be another 5 people and 3 armoured cars and the rest of it. So, there is just this sort of being able to decompress side of things. But no, I think public service is a huge honour. And that, I say, I'm very ambitious for the country. I think there's a lot to be done. I'm, needless to say, not happy with the things which are being done to the country at the moment by this new administration. And so, yes, the bug hasn't been beaten out of me.
Well, let's talk about this leadership contest. You're backing James Cleverly. You're chairing his campaign. What do you see in him that you don't see in the other 3?
So I think actually we're lucky we've got some good candidates. The final 4, Kemi, James Cleverly, Jenrick and Tom Tugg are all worthy candidates in this. The reason I think that Cleverly edges this is that he has that experience. He's been in the most important Secretary of State roles, including Home Office, including the Foreign Office. In other words, he really knows what needs to happen. He really sees it for himself. He's seen it for himself and had the experience. And I think that actually trumps the other candidates based on experience alone. He's also a very, very smart, sensible guy who I think represents the kind of country that we should live in. One which is pragmatic but ambitious, and a country that knows that we can be, better than we are at the moment. So for lots of reasons, I think he's the right guy for the job.
Why do your former colleagues and the new MPs that are coming, they've placed him in 3rd place in the rankings? I mean, given his experience, given that he's very likeable, he must be disappointed to have only got 21 votes in the last round.
I wouldn't really, actually, interestingly, I wouldn't read very much into the exact ranking for a couple of simple reasons. One, unfortunately, the electorate, the MPs, the selectorate, is very small. It's a third of the size that it was at the last leadership election. So you only need very small numbers of people moving, and it looks like a big difference, as it were. So it's not, I think, statistically quite as relevant. And secondly, because you have some MPs who might be, some candidates who might be seen to be on similar territory, that tends to split the vote. And as you get through the next rounds, to take it down to the last 2, I think it's very likely indeed that James Cleverly succeeds in being into that final. So we'll have to see. But I think I wouldn't really read too much into it. Depends on who happens to go out in which order as to the way that tends to look. Priti Patel went out first. Her votes were much more likely to transfer to other candidates. Mel's gone out the second time. We don't know where Mel Stride's votes will transfer because we haven't had another vote.
Yeah. Some people are saying that he needs to show a bit more oomph, that he I've always thought in any leadership contest, the candidates who demonstrate that they want it most tend to do best. And I think Robert Jenrick is a good example of that, where, I mean, I was astonished that he's in the position he is, because he's almost come from nowhere, but has run a very out there campaign in a way that maybe the other three haven't, and that may impress Conservative Party members quite a lot.
Yeah, I think in any election, actually, it is an important point that the electorate, whoever they are, want to know that you are working hard for their support. So I think you make a good point. Having said that, I've seen James very passionate and worked up about a whole range of issues that kind of matter to people's actual lives. I think he's also, the other thing he's got is extremely, there's a horrible word they use, but relatable. I mean, he basically is a person who can actually do the one thing that the Conservative Party needs to do. Now, if you're listening to this, you may or may not be a supporter of the Conservatives, but at least we want to have someone who's going to be able to sort of get through the kind of noise and the sound, and actually you hear this person and you think, well, I may not agree, but at least I'm listening to them and I understand what they're trying to tell me. I think that's what James Cleverly's got, and I think he, obviously in the next few weeks of this contest, and particularly at party conference, he'll be getting out there to demonstrate that. Okay, right, let's go back to calls. Robert's in Birmingham. Hello, Robert.
Hi, first time caller.
Welcome.
Yeah, can I ask a question? I'd like to ask Mr. Jenrick, what's the end game?
It's Grant Shapps. Robert Jenrick will be on next week.
Grant, sorry. Yeah, what I'd like to know, what is the end game? I mean, we're spending maybe, 100 billion on the war? I mean, I'm talking with America and everybody else contributing. We've spent over 100 billion. But what is the end game? What if it goes on for another year, 2 years? What is the end game?
Yeah, well, look, I think wars are expensive. The question is, what would be more expensive, capitulating or fighting this war? The simple answer is this is vastly, vastly cheaper than capitulation. It wouldn't just cost us financially in terms of the amount that weapons cost. It would cost us in all sorts of other ways, including our way of life. And actually, what's interesting is Britain militarily, and this year I pushed up the contribution to 3 billion, but actually militarily we have spent far less than we spent, for example, on simply protecting people from the higher energy bills the winter before last, where we were paying half of the average family's energy bill, half of the business bill. And that energy cost was tens of billions, whereas we've put in about 10 billion or less in terms of arms. So rather than supporting my point, it's far more expensive to let a tyrant win, as Europe has learnt, I would have hoped, particularly in the Second World War, than it is to stand up against bullies and tyrants.
What is the end game here? How do you envisage this ending?
I personally think the end game needs to be Putin defeated.
And you genuinely think that that's possible?
Yes,
probable?
It's totally possible. And actually, for a fraction of the NATO budget. That's the outrageous thing. If NATO simply put its back into this a bit, and we showed the leadership, and others followed us, then Putin would be finished in Ukraine. But by the way, Putin's only in Ukraine because we failed to stand up to him when he walked into Crimea, part of Ukraine, back in 2014. We did very little when he walked into Chechnya, and every other location he's decided to invade. And eventually, tyrants get the idea that the world doesn't really care. It might say it does, but if you don't do anything about it, they carry on.
I wonder when people are actually going to hold Barack Obama to account for all of this, because everyone seems to see him as some slight hero figure in political history. But if he had made different decisions in those days, we might not be where we are. I mean, hindsight is easy, I get that.
Well, actually, the summer before 2013, when all of that stuff was going on in Syria, we had a vote in our parliament at which Ed Miliband was leader of the opposition and had said that he would support us protecting the skies so that Assad wouldn't gas his own people, pulled out of that on the day of the actual vote itself. I remember flying back from the US to come and vote, and we lost that vote. And that was followed immediately by Barack Obama saying initially that he would hold a vote in Congress because we'd done so in Parliament on the same issue. And in the time that was taking to arrange, Putin, who wasn't seen as the pariah he is today, or not quite as much, said that he'd done a deal with Assad, so Assad wouldn't gas his own people and we didn't need to intervene. And stupidly, the West believed it all. 2013 led to the 2014 Crimea invasion and the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. You don't stand up to bullies. This is what happens.
Robert, thank you very much for that. Coming up at 8 on Cross Question, I'll be joined by Baroness Margaret Hodge, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Theresa Villas, Gito Harry, former spokesman for Boris Johnson, and Jovan Owusu-Nepal. You think, who he? Well, he was Nigel Farage's Labour opponent in Clacton and is the best dressed man in British politics. Well, we'll test that out in a few minutes when we see him. You can phone him with your questions for that right now. 0345 6060 973. It's 7:46.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
The downfall and the disgrace is complete, the end of the career of Hugh Edwards, but he has avoided jail. Jan's in Norfolk.
He's put children as young as 7 or whatever age, he's put them in a lifetime of prison.
Yes.
I was abused as a child. I'm 66 now and I'm still suffering.
Joe's in Putney.
We know that currently the law do not allow for anything harsher than apparently he got. But this 7 or 9-year-old, however old they were, there's no care for them.
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7.
With Betfair, where odds move faster than polls. Play responsibly.
LBC.
Hi there.
Dale on LBC. Text 84850.
10 to 8 is the time. Grant Shapps is with us. Let's go back to your calls. Adrian's in Cambridge. Hello, Adrian.
Hi there.
Hi. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, why are the UK not condemning and sanctioning Israel? Because they're doing so many things they shouldn't be doing, committing genocide and ethnic cleansing in Gaza and the West Bank, breaching numerous international laws, disregarding numerous human rights acts, committing terrorist acts in the Middle East. assassinating peace negotiators and hostage negotiators. I'm just so angry about it. I don't know why the UK support Islam.
So it's interesting in your question that you didn't start with the fact that Israel was attacked by people who are actually terrorists, not just calling them terrorists for the sake of it. I mean, actually defined by law in this country as terrorists. There's, of course, Hamas, who started this by breaking in and murdering 1,200 plus people, raping people, holding them hostage, with some of them still hostage. And I'm interested you didn't choose to mention that. I'm interested you also didn't choose to mention what Iran has been doing, or what Hezbollah has been doing, what the Houthis have been doing. But putting all of that aside, I don't condone Israel's approach to this. In fact, I don't even agree with it. And I've spoken out about that before. I don't have to agree with a government in the same way as I don't agree with this government in this country, because I don't think that Starmer's government's doing the right things for this country in many different ways. But it doesn't mean that I want to sanction the country for that, because they are something that Hamas are not, and that's called a democracy. And they actually are a legitimate state, a state that allows everyone, including Arabs in that country, to vote. And I don't see that equivalence, and I'm surprised when. And look, there are many things that I, feel unhappy about the way that Israel goes about all manner of different things, and I profoundly disagree with many of the things, and particularly the things that Netanyahu, their prime minister, does. But that is different. That's to separate the government from the country, and I just don't know how anyone can sort of call in and not condone and condemn terrorists who murdered people and are still holding hostages. And it's a mystery why you'd be so one-sided about it.
Adrian?
Sorry, 95% of Israelis support the genocide in Gaza.
No, they don't.
They do?
No. This is the sort of thing that, people who want to believe a certain view of this say. I'd actually say most Israelis are probably deeply uncomfortable with what's going on. And actually, if you watch what's actually going on in Israel, you'll see the huge demonstrations every single weekend against the Israeli government, against their own government. But you see, that's the difference. They have a democracy. People are allowed to demonstrate. People are allowed to object. If you do that in the countries that are supporting Hamas, Iran in particular, then you won't survive for very long.
OK, Adrian, thank you very much for that. Just before we go on to the next call, what do you make of this story that's broken this afternoon about the pagers, Hezbollah pagers exploding? The Israeli military haven't commented on it, but naturally everyone's thinking, well, they must be responsible. Is that a legitimate sort of way to fight them?
Yeah, no, it's an extraordinary story, and frankly, I only know as much as you and everyone else.
I don't know anything about it, apart from what I've read.
It is an extraordinary story, as you say. Actually, Israel hasn't commented either, and I don't know the truth to it. We do know, again, and this is where I find it very troubling, that people will call in, like Adrian there, as if there's a moral equivalence between a terrorist organisation like Hezbollah, recognised as a terrorist organisation by us, by America, by much of the rest of the civilised world, and a state trying to defend its own borders. And, if Hezbollah stopped firing rockets into Israel, that conflict on the northern Israeli, southern Lebanese border would be over tomorrow. And by the way, when I talk to the Lebanese government, which I regularly did when I was Defence Secretary, they are deeply troubled by this terrorist organisation called Hezbollah operating within Lebanon as well. So, let's call terrorists what they are, and, actually think about ending these conflicts by having the terrorists stopping their behaviour. But I'm afraid I've got nothing really I can add to the exploding question. I just don't know the answer.
But is it a legitimate tactic to use? I mean, assuming it is Israel that's done it.
Look, as I say, it's hard to know. I do know that thousands of rockets are fired from Lebanon into Israel. There are still 100,000 people, plus maybe 140,000 displaced in northern Israel because of this. The best way to secure peace would be for a terrorist organisation like Hezbollah to stop doing this. Again, sponsored by Iran, not welcome in Lebanon by the Lebanese people and government themselves.
Right, Sean. No, it isn't. It's Scott in Glasgow. Hello, Scott. Hi.
Hello.
What would you like to ask?
So, not talking about terrorist organisations, but talking about an actual national government at the current point in time. Since the start of this war between Russia and Ukraine, we have supported Ukraine, we have put sanctions on Russia, we have done our bit, and as you said, taken the lead within the world in that. I'm curious as to why we've not taken the lead in the world in another way. Since the start of this war, India, and in particular Narendra Modi's government, has supported Russia, has undermined our sanctions. And only recently, Modi visited Russia in July. And there's a big picture of him shaking Putin warmly by the hand, and news stories about potential defence and weapons deals between the two organisations. When a country who we are commercially and regularly in contact with, we do a lot of business with India, is undermining our position on the international stage. Why are we not doing something about that? Why are we not restricting Indian companies from getting UK government contracts? Why are we not putting sanctions on Indian trades? Why are we allowing not an ally, but certainly a commercial partner, which we do trillions of business with between the US, the UK and others? Why are we not applying pressure to Modi and his government to say, stop supporting this bully as you described him, Grant?
Yeah. No, it's an excellent point, actually. I found, as so often, I was a Foreign Office Minister years ago before I was Defence Minister, and when you look at international affairs, often the upshot is less than perfect or ideal, and you get to the point where there's almost not a country in the world which supports precisely our view, our worldview. A country like India is really interesting because they're sort of one of these middle powers where they are on terms with both sides in this particular conflict, and there's a lot of trade, particularly in things like coal and energy, that goes on between them, and I do find it troubling. And a lot of that work goes on behind the scenes rather than in big public rows and bust-ups. But I think it is this question of, in the end, is it the case that everybody who doesn't represent exactly your worldview, you refuse to work with or issue sanctions against, and then in the end, who you actually working with at all? And that will sound like an unsatisfactory answer, but there's a further point to it, which is you can get to an absolutist point to such a degree that you, in the end, push countries into the arms of essentially your enemies because you refuse to deal with them yourselves, and that then strengthens the pact between them. So I have a lot of sympathy with your point. I think I'm very uncomfortable about the amount of trade that's going on between India and Did
you have a conversation with the Indian Defence Minister about this? And what was the response during business?
Well, actually, I had it more when I was in the business portfolio when I was business secretary. And
I've forgotten that one.
Yes, I think we got that one done. And they'll say, "Well, look, we're only doing this, and we've cut this back, and we no longer work like that." But I think that Scott raises a very, very valid point. It's an imperfect, messy world. India has a huge population, is a massive economy, and in the end, you have to make the decision about whether you want to try to influence an economy like that, which is in terms of quality of life and GDP growing very fast in your direction, or preemptively cut them off and probably push them into the arms of those who you're not friendly with.
Scott, thank you for that. Final word from Trevor in Burgess Hill. Can I say that I know through a colleague firsthand that Mr. Shapps not just talks the talk but walks the walk on Ukraine? He has terrible politics, as I'm an old lefty, but I will not hear a bad word against him. Well, there you go. You'll settle for that, will you?
I'll settle for an old lefty.
Grant, thank you very much indeed for being with us over the last hour. As I say, Tom Tugendhat coming in at 9, otherwise he'd be with Ben Kentish. But first, cross-question coming up in the next couple of minutes. I'll be joined in the studio by Baroness Margaret Hodge, Labour peer, former MP and Minister, Teresa Villas, former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister, Gito Harry, former Downing Street Director of Communications when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister, and Jovan Owusu-Nepal, Labour activist who was the party's candidate who took on Nigel Farage in Clacton in the general election. They'll all be here to answer your questions. We've cleared the switchboard. Get your calls in now, 0345 6060 973. You can WhatsApp on the same number, text 84850, and we'd love you to watch us on Global Player.
on your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at